Welcome to Issues That Matter. I'm Cynthia Pooler. My guest today is Alan Collinge, the founder of Student Loan Justice. And Alan is here to talk about the Supreme Court ruling. So, Alan, uh, what happened and what do you think the ramifications are?
Well, yeah. So just for your audience, Biden had proposed to cancel $10,000 across the board for all federal student loan borrowers, and included even up to $20,000 for people who had received the Pell Grant. And these are for direct federal student loans. And we were thrilled. It was our group that had initiated the whole public conversation in the first place about canceling student loans by executive order. It's a very interesting wrinkle there. So we were watching this case quite intently, as you might imagine. But unfortunately, the Supreme Court struck down Biden's loan cancellation for no very good reason either, and we can talk about that in a bit. But it was pretty much evidence that the Supreme Court truly has become a political animal. And I say that for a couple of reasons. First of all, Donald Trump, Republican, was in fact the first president to cancel student loan debt by executive order. He did it not once, but arguably twice, or even more if you really think about it. But even before the pandemic, Donald Trump canceled student loans broadly for tens of thousands of disabled veterans. And he did it by executive order, and he did it without much fanfare. He did it with no objection, no lawsuit, etc. And then again, after the pandemic started very early in the pandemic, March 2020, President Trump canceled student loan debt by executive order by initiating the repayment pause, which canceled a very significant amount of interest for direct federal student loan borrowers everywhere. So there's no real good reason that the Supreme Court struck this down. They pointed to various doctrine out there, but the point is, Trump did it. Biden could have done it. We weren't very impressed with the way Biden did do it because, quite frankly, Joe Biden could have essentially done what Donald Trump did and simply canceled the loans, and then maybe announced it later or something like that. Biden, I think Biden was very insincere. Quite frankly, I think Joe Biden never really wanted to cancel federal student loans by executive order. And I think many other Democrats, including people like Susan Rice and Nancy Pelosi, and many Democratic wealthy benefactors, let's just say, people like the Swig family in California. We can talk about that if you want. But there was a deep undercurrent of resistance to canceling student loans by executive order in Washington, D.C. on both sides of the aisle. So this was really, this was kind of an inside job, in my view. This was something that almost nobody in Washington, D.C. really wanted to see. And even if you listen to like the headlines from NPR and you sort of read between the lines, you can tell that the Democratic elite did not want to cancel student loans by executive order. Many Democrats claim that they're interested in that they support student loan cancellation through Congress, which in the paraphrased words of NPR is the right way to cancel student loan debt. But that's just nonsense. I'll just one quick detail why that's true. The president can cancel loans by executive order without needing one dime from the Treasury, without needing one penny added to the national debt, unlike PPP loans or any of the other fiscal stimulus we saw during COVID, et cetera. Nobody in Washington, D.C. makes any money when you do it that way. In fact, no money even changes hands. It's just a write-off of bad debt, and it doesn't benefit anyone in Washington, D.C. When you cancel student loans through Congress, however, because of longstanding PAYGO rules, in order to cancel $1 in federal student loan debt, you have to raise $1 from the taxpayers. So to cancel, let's say $200 billion in federal student loan debt through Congress, you have to pay for it. So you have to raise $200 billion from the taxpayers. And at least then some money changes hands, right? Washington, D.C. gets $200 of new money in from the taxpayers. And the Department of Education certainly doesn't mind that a bit. Neither do many other sort of adjunct organizations. And I would call them sort of student loan swamp minions. That's something that they can work with. But taking two steps back, you have to realize how ridiculous that is, because the federal government paid for these loans many years ago. That $1.6 trillion outstanding in federal student loan debt, the government owns those loans and paid for those loans many years ago. And they paid nowhere even close to $1.6 trillion. They paid a tiny fraction of that. The large majority of that number represents interest and penalties and fees and other things that were generated out of thin air, wealth that was generated out of thin air, and interest, penalties, fees, etc. There is no good reason for the taxpayers have to pay not just twice for these loans, the first time to make them, the second time to cancel them, but actually far more than twice, because of accrued interest and other charges that have hyperinflated the loans. So we're disappointed, but we're not going anywhere. Strategically, I guess you could say, it was actually a very fortuitous decision from our perspective, because had this loan cancellation been successful, close to 20 million people would have been completely freed of their student loan debt. So people who owe $10,000 or less, or $20,000 or less, who have the Pell Grant, that would have taken the heat almost completely out of this issue. It would be very difficult for us to get anything done going forward had this loan cancellation been allowed.
Let me ask you one question, Alan.
Yeah.
The loan cancellation was for 10,000 and then 20,000 for some people. Okay, but for people who went to college and became doctors and lawyers, and they spent an awful lot of money, or they borrowed an awful lot of money, what percentage do you think of people are in that group who owe 100,000 or more? What do you think?
Well, on the books, people who owe it's maybe 15% or so, but there are a huge, the average student loan borrower is carrying around $40,000 in student loan debt. But there's a huge number of people who are in that sort of middle ground, that 50 to over $100,000. And these are the worst hurt borrowers, Cynthia, I should say. A lot of people on our group have way over $100,000 in student loan debt, and these people usually only borrowed maybe in the low tens of thousands of dollars initially. So just one example I always use, I don't know why, there's a woman in our group. She originally borrowed $26,000 back in the 80s and 90s. Well, to date, she has repaid over $100,000 on these loans, but she still owes on paper $135,000 or so. So there are a lot of people in that boat. What the percentage is, oh, I wouldn't want to quote anything. Don't hold me to this, but it's somewhere around maybe 15 or 20%, I think, I want to say.
Okay.
Um,
Okay. So,
but the worst hurt borrowers, like the people who I just mentioned, they wouldn't have been helped by this loan cancellation at all.
uh-huh.
A lot of people in our group, myself included, actually, uh, they'll say, they'll say things like, you may as well add $10,000 onto my balance because this is chicken feed. This is chump change. This is inconsequential.
Okay. One of the arguments that I've heard, and this is an argument that I've heard for quite a while, people who have paid off their loans are angry that maybe the loan cancellation was going to go through. Their attitude was, if I paid mine, they have to pay theirs. And it's like pitting one group of people against the other. What do you think about that?
This is an argument that is trotted first and foremost out by our opposition quite frequently. To people who have repaid their student loans in years or more often decades in the past, I salute them. I congratulate them on having the financial wherewithal to be able to repay their loans. But the fact, this is no longer their problem. It is not. And the fact on the ground, regardless of everything else, is that before the pandemic, 58.9% of all borrowers were not able to repay on their loans. Even before the pandemic, 85%, so that's more than 4 out of 5, 85% of all borrowers were never going to be able to repay their loans. They had either stopped paying, and that was, as I said, 58.9%, or they were paying and paying and paying, and their loan balances were going up. So this is not the problem of people who don't hold these loans. And by the way, this is not the taxpayer's problem. As best as I can determine, the overwhelming majority, maybe even the entire federal student loan portfolio at this point is pure profit. So the people have up to this point repaid their debt to the taxpayer.
Mhm.
Depending on who you talk to, the federal government was being repaid by the borrowers, by us, something like between 70 and 85 billion dollars per year. And this is while lending out maybe $95 billion per year. So the people have paid, and some people have paid through the absolute nose. But, past performance is no guarantee of future results. And I can tell you that even before this pandemic, as I said, the large majority of borrowers, nearly 3 out of 5, were unable to make payments on their loans. And that is going to go up dramatically when they try and turn these loans back on. My best estimate, Cynthia, is that when they try and turn these loan repayments back on, probably 80% of all borrowers will not pay. They will not resume paying on their loans.
Okay.
People are done.
The other thing that I've noticed is if somebody defaults on a loan, the banks love that because their credit rating gets higher. And if they want to borrow money, they have to pay it back at a more substantial rate, right? So the banks, I think, are happy about this, right?
Well, in years past, decades past, that absolutely has been true. Even the federal government, even the Department of Education, which is sort of the queen hornet of the nest, they have found a way to make a profit, not a loss, a profit on defaulted student loans. That is a defining hallmark of a predatory lending system. And indeed, the collection companies, the many others, they don't mind defaulted loans at all. And in fact, the
Mm.
really the kind of the golden unicorn, the fantasy, if you will, of the student debt collection industry, is to see these loans turned back on and the constitutionally enshrined right of bankruptcy remain gone from the loans. This gives them a license to steal in many different ways, including what you just mentioned. So this is going to be a very, very tricky and difficult time when they do turn these loans back on. It is a fact that very few people will resume paying. They can't do it. You know, they've been not paying for the past 3.5 years. Inflation has sucked away all of the benefit that they were getting from not having to pay. Um, and you know, their financial situations have changed. It's just not going to happen. We are going to see a mass default on these federal student loans. And if bankruptcy, at a minimum, if the right of bankruptcy remains gone from the loans, and the borrowers are essentially like fish in a barrel for the predatory student debt collection industry, it's going to get very, very ugly. And you know, I don't want to talk too much. I don't want to talk too much inside baseball here, but none of the other groups in the country claiming to be fighting for student loan borrowers, none of them are fighting for the return of bankruptcy rights to student loans. This is exactly what the debt collection industry wants. And quite frankly, I find that suspicious. And I don't want to go into too much detail here, but I'll just say that we have seen some very suspicious evidence indicating that many of the other groups who claim to be fighting for student loan borrowers, they've got very nefarious ties to the student loan industry, and in particular to the debt collection industry. So this whole thing just stinks to high heaven.
Okay, so it was a 6-3 majority, and the six are Republican appointees. So for the 2024 election, is this going to be a big issue? And is this going to make Biden look like the knight in shining armor for a cancellation of 10 to 20,000?
That's probably the most important, most significant question of the day. Yeah, yes. This is going to make the Democrats look great, and the Republicans are going to regret this Supreme Court case hugely, all things being equal, in the elections next year. This isn't, first of all, we're a fiercely nonpartisan group, Cynthia. This is not a partisan issue. The most recent Pew Research data that I've looked at from 2020 show that something like 70% of everyone with student loans is either Republican or independent. And as I said, 85% of those 43 million federal student loan borrowers were never going to be able to repay their loans, even before the pandemic. That's 38 million people who vote. 70% of them being Republican or independent, 38 million people who are losing sleep at night about their federal student loans. And so it is just the height of just stupidity that this became a political football, and the Republicans are absolutely alienating and pushing away a huge percentage of their own base. You know, nearly 1 in 5 U.S. adults, so 1 in 5 of all adults in this country have student loans, and nearly that many, 85% of those people, we're never going to be able to repay their student loans. So this is a huge voting bloc, Cynthia. This is really, in my view, it's the largest sort of untethered, sort of largest emerging voting bloc in our nation's history. And so the Republicans are idiots. And I will just say, if the Republicans want to avoid what we saw in the midterm elections last time, where they just eked out a meager win instead of that red wave they were predicting,
Right.
or even the election in 2020, quite frankly, where critical states like Georgia, Nevada, Michigan, Pennsylvania, others decided that race. All those states that I just mentioned, Cynthia, are absolutely buried in federal student loan debt. So you wonder what happened to the red wave? Student loans happened, and this is going to get far, far, far worse for the Republicans if they don't do something. And when I say something, I mean the core of this problem, which is the number one thing we've always been fighting for: return bankruptcy protections to these loans. Founding fathers called for uniform bankruptcy rights in the Constitution, and this has been uniquely taken away from student loans. It lies at the core of the entire problem. We've been we were very keenly interested in loan cancellation, but we were never very interested in Biden's lame, feckless $10,000 gimmick, which is what it was. Let's be honest. I don't think Biden ever really wanted to cancel loans in the first place. You know, before the election, Biden said he was, I'm going to eliminate your student loan debt if you went to public college, he said. And then shortly after he won the election, he said, no, I will not be doing that. And he was led to the loan cancellation that he did do, kicking and screaming. He never wanted to do it. The Democratic elite never wanted him to do it. And that much is just abundantly obvious. But, politics are politics. A lot of people don't follow this. Even people with student loans don't follow this issue very closely. And the Democrats have played the Republicans like a fiddle on this issue. And it just boggles the mind.
So the majority on the Supreme Court, the Republican appointees, when they came up with their decision, the 6-3 decision, didn't the Republican justices realize that it was going to hurt in the presidential election?
I can't speak for the Supreme Court justices. It was a very flimsy case. Like, even standing alone was a question. And indeed, there were two different lawsuits, and the first lawsuit was tossed out for lack of standing. The second lawsuit that went through, there was also standing questions there. And so the case was flimsy, and the actual meat of the case itself was extremely flimsy. As I said, Donald Trump did this by executive order twice, no fanfare, no objection. And the law that Biden used which was weak law. There was other law that he could have used that was stronger, but even the weaker, sort of more ill-fitting law that he did use, that was pretty clear and unambiguous, and precedent had already been set by Trump. So I don't know what was going through the Supreme Court's mind, Cynthia. I know at least one of the justices, Samuel Alito, he had been wined and dined by billionaires who through their money and their contributions to various groups, had standing opposition to loan cancellation. One of the groups that a guy named Paul Singer, billionaire, funded, had filed an amicus brief opposing this student loan cancellation. So I don't know what went into this, but I don't think it was. I think it was political. I think it was a political decision. I think politics overrode precedent in this case, and sad to see. But the Republicans are digging their own grave, and they're going to rue the day. My hope here, and I was interviewed. Actually, did a really good in-depth half-hour interview with Fox News about this on Friday. This still comes down to bankruptcy, Cynthia. Founding fathers called for uniform bankruptcy rights in the Constitution ahead of the power to declare war and raise an army in the Constitution. And that remains far more true today, far more urgently true today, I would say, than it ever has in the past.
I'm sorry, who interviewed you on Fox?
It was actually a Fox News radio host named Eben Brown.
Okay.
And so there's a half-hour podcast on the Fox News website. It's called the Fox News Rundown.
Okay.
Uh, and so it's a 30-minute interview. And I would urge people out there to listen to this. We did a very, very high quality deep dive on the question of bankruptcy.
Mm-hmm.
And to your viewers out there, I know a lot of people out there are like, why does he keep mentioning bankruptcy? Why is that so important? The absence of bankruptcy lies at the entire core of this whole entire problem. When you take bankruptcy rights away from a lending instrument, and it really hasn't been done for any other loans in this country since the founding of the country. This is an unprecedented thing. When you take bankruptcy rights away, you give the lenders a license to steal. You give them a license to hyperinflate a loan, legally or maybe even often illegally. This is exactly the sort of lending tyranny. I would call it tyranny since the federal government is involved. This is the kind of thing that the founding fathers wanted to avoid when they called for uniform bankruptcy laws, aka rights, in the Constitution.
Mm-hmm.
And so everybody out there with student loans needs to realize, if you want to actually see this problem solved, we've got to get the leverage of bankruptcy on our side first. And unless and until that happens, we'll be begging Joe Biden or the next president until the cows come home to cancel student loans.
Mm-hmm.
And what we'll get is this nonsense like what we've already seen with Joe Biden.
You and I have been talking about this issue for a number of years. What's in store for the future as far as student loan justice?
Yeah, that's a great question, Cynthia. It's going to get very ugly when these loans are turned back on. Very few people will repay. As I said, probably 80% of all borrowers will not resume paying on their loans. We continue, and we're going to double, triple, quadruple down on convincing Congress to return bankruptcy rights to student loans.
Mm-hmm.
So last session, we were betrayed by the Democrats. The Republicans never really did anything in the first place, but the Democrats really hurt us because they had it in the DNC platform for 8 years now to return bankruptcy rights to student loans. So the Democrats really stabbed us in the back on this one. We're going to see. We're going to keep fighting to get Congress to finally do the right thing, finally return bankruptcy rights to these loans. But I'll be honest with you, Cynthia, and we put a press release out on Friday to this effect. We're at this point, we're calling on all federal student loan borrowers to defer, forbear, or otherwise withhold payment on these loans going forward, unless and until the constitutionally enshrined right of bankruptcy is returned to the loans. In my humble opinion, well, first of all, it's just a fact that almost nobody is going to resume paying on their loans going forward. But in my humble opinion, they shouldn't. In my humble opinion, it is not only probably unwise, it is unpatriotic at this point for anybody with federal student loans to be paying their hard-earned money into this tyrannical Washington, D.C. lending beast. That doesn't help anyone. Don't feed the beast, I say. And, regardless of what I say, that's going to happen. We are going to see and strike is absolutely not the right word on this. Strike is not the right word. I think this lending system is finished, Cynthia. I think this lending system is done. But certainly, it's going to get ugly. And that is the reality.
So there's been a number of declared presidential candidates. Have you reached out to any of them? And has any of them contacted you?
No, Cynthia. Both the Democrats and the Republicans have demonstrated over the 18 long years that we've been doing this, that neither of those parties and no candidates from those parties can be trusted. no matter what's out of their mouth. Joe Biden said he was going to eliminate student loan debt for people who went to public colleges and earn
Yes,
less than
but he
100.
was the one that created this whole
I
mess.
know, exactly. And so is it too for pretty much any candidate from either of the major parties, Cynthia. The Democrats are not trustworthy on this. The Republicans are absolutely not trustworthy on this, regardless of what comes out of their mouth. I've heard Marianne Williamson say, "Oh yeah, I'll cancel student loans," but you can tell she's not. She's just throwing that up there as a talking point. They're just trying to corral votes, and we're just not buying it. In my humble opinion, both parties have just massively failed, and I cannot see any scenario where we'll be endorsing any candidate who runs under the Democratic Party flag or the Republican flag. It's just become a joke at this point. I think people have to wake up to that fact.
Well, what I find very interesting is, the past couple of cycles, you got endorsed by the Green Party. You spoke to Howie Hawkins, he supported you, but it looks like Cornel West is going to be the standard bearer for the Greens. Has he contacted you?
I actually thought he was running with the People's Party or something. No. We've had no contact with almost any presidential candidates of any note up to this point. But yeah, I mean, we endorsed the Green Party going back to 2016, kind of looking like maybe that'll happen unless somebody really exciting jumps into the race. But that remains to be seen. So knock on wood. We're just kind of in reflection mode right now for the next week or two. We're going to sit back and see what sort of response we get from Washington, D.C. We had great bankruptcy legislation last year, Cynthia.
Right.
And we have every reason to believe that that these loans, we are fighting to get bankruptcy Congress, and we do need Congress for this. We're fighting very hard to get Congress to return these bankruptcy rights to student loans before the repayments start September 1st. So that's going to be our number one key focus. But, we will probably end up going to Iowa and South Carolina and some of the other early primary states towards the end of the summer and into the fall. And, we'll see what next year brings. At this point, it's kind of everything's in flux. Friday, the Supreme Court decision was a bit of an inflection point. So it's kind of the Wild West out there right now. But to all the student loan borrowers out there, the lending system has failed. It's not coming back. I don't care what the people in Washington, D.C. do, don't do, say, don't say. This lending system is finished, and you can quote me on that, because very few people will resume making payments on their loans going forward.
So I'll contact you at the beginning of September, and if the repayment thing goes into effect, and as the political calendar, the presidential calendar evolves, I'll contact you, and maybe you could enlighten everybody as to what's going on.
That would be great, Cynthia. I stand at your beck and call.
Thank you so much. You've been listening to Alan Collinge. Hey, so Alan, I'm sure that there's people who are kind of upset over the decision. If they want to join your group, how could they do so?
Yeah, absolutely, and we're going to need them. We've seen what the swamp is going to do, and I'm telling you, the wallflowers out there, the people who've been watching and waiting and worrying and wringing their hands and wondering what's going to happen. Well, we just saw what's going to happen as long as people sit on their ass and don't do anything. People need to come to studentloanjustice.org. We are literally the only group that I'm aware of that's actually fighting this battle as it needs to be fought. We're fighting for actual student loan justice, not pretend. And they need to come seek us out and find us and help, because we need them.
Okay, so I'll contact you at the beginning of September, and as this whole election season evolves, we'll be talking. So you've been listening to Alan Collinge. I'm Cynthia Pooler. This is Issues That Matter. If you like the show, please subscribe to my YouTube channel. Alan, thank you, and thank you everybody for listening. Have a great day.
Thank you, Cynthia.